Do you hear that, everybody? That is the sound of silence because unfortunately, I do not have Omar with me here today to say Eric. For me to then say Omar, for him to then start bantering, read a few reviews, hopefully one 5-star, hopefully one 1-star. We have ironic things to say, yada yada, and there we go. So today, it's just me, folks. This is an unprecedented episode of Iron Culture where it is just your dear Eric Helms here to chat about things today. So you may remember that at the end of last year, Omar and I dropped the bombshell, which rocked the cult, saying, hey, we're not necessarily going to be here every single Monday. It might end up being every other week or sometimes a more scattered schedule because we got big plans for 2023. And this is probably us, or I should say me trying to just to soften that blow a little bit, because today was possibly going to be a bye week. Omar is traveling. He's doing some very important business work for Raskol Apparel. And very soon, I'm also going to be traveling and going to the Sheffield with Omar. That's just a month away now, believe it or not. Well, a month and a week. I'll be coaching Jessica Bittner. We'll be meeting up with Connor Heffernan. We'll be meeting up with Dr. Pack and Milo Wolf. These are all folks you've heard of. They've been on the podcast. And it's going to be our first filming trip of 2023 for the Iron Culture documentary. We're going to have elements of history. We're going to have elements of science. We're going to have elements of culture. And we're going to hit up all three while we're in the UK. We're going to be, of course, at the Sheffield. We'll all be coaching. We'll be filming, interviewing athletes. SBD has been very gracious with allowing us to take part in that. So big shout out to SBD. Thank you, Pete Spence. And then after that, we're going to go down to Solent University with Dr. Pack, Milo Wolf, and talk to some other great academics, folks I've worked with who are just legends in the field, like Dr. James Steele and others. And then we're going to take a trip with Connor Heffernan to Ireland, where we're going to learn about some of the stone lifting and also the oldest gym that exists in Ireland. So that's just a little bit of a sneak peek for what's going on in March. So when we have one of these instances where neither one of us shows up on a Monday, always a Monday, never a Tuesday, how dare you, or if there's an incident where one of us says, you know what, I gotcha, because the other one is too busy, like this first time occurrence where I am doing a solo episode of Iron Culture, just know that it's for good reason. It's for good purpose. And I know that half of your heart is bleeding right now, but I would only ask you to accept me as the humble offering of at least half the cult leaders, that is. You are all here with me. And hopefully you'll stay through this whole episode, even though it won't necessarily have that lovely banter and jovial Canadian plucky spirit that it normally has. So today, that's what we're going to be talking about is some science, because I play the straight man on Iron Culture. Omar's the jokey guy, and we have that kind of connection. So I know we're missing some of that, I guess, that 80s buddy cop feel that you've grown to love. But you are going to get a little dose of Helms, and hopefully that'll tide you over until next week when we're back onto our regular schedule. So what does that mean? Well, today I've got two things to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit more about specificity. In my upcoming Mass article, which is the cover story for the March 1st Mass issue that is coming out. And by the way, we have some big announcements that I can't actually scoop that's coming out on March 1st. So definitely Mass subscribers and folks who might be interested in subscribing to Mass, pay attention. When we drop our issue on the 1st, we got things to talk about, things to say, things to announce, but we're still going to have our cover stories that are also published for free on strongerbyscience.com. So on the 1st, this will be a written topic you can read about my thoughts in more depth on, but I figured I would talk about it a bit here as well. And it's an article on specificity and our better understanding of the SAID principle, what it means. And these are things I've been thinking about and talking about for a long time. I first did a video in Mass on specificity back in volume 4. So that was 3 years ago. And I've had conversations like this going way back. I remember when I first met Dr. Mike Zerdos, who was a good friend of mine, colleague, one of my fellow authors at Mass, and was my secondary supervisor when I did my PhD. We had kind of an informal debate at a 2013 RTS seminar that he put on in Australia. First time I met him. And we had a really good talk about specificity and daily 1RM training. And I was, more in opposition to his perspective at the time, but both of us have evolved since then. So I'm really excited to kind of share my perspective on the said principle in that article and also in this podcast episode. Also, big shout out to Dr. Bill Campbell. He has his lab at the University of South Florida, and he did some great work. My good friend, Dr. Eric Trexler, was one of the authors on this. Another person at Mass, one of our reviewers, and they recently published the newest diet break study that's now through full peer review. You could read about this study if you were paying attention to it in abstract form, which I believe it was published at the International Society of Sports Nutrition's conference, and you could find that online, just kind of like an abstract. But now the full paper is in peer review, and it's through peer review. It's great, and I think it's high time that we did a bit of an update on kind of like where is the diet break literature at. So that's the main topics I'm going to cover today. So it's going to be a little more of a science-heavy episode. You're not surprised. It's just me. So we'll cover those two topics, and just have like one other announcement, and then we'll get into it. Since we're talking about specificity, since we're talking about diet breaks, I just want to give a big shout out to NASM. That's the National Academy of Sports Medicine. Guillermo Escalante, who you may recall has been on the podcast, Dr. Guillermo Escalante, who has done work in trying to make enhanced bodybuilding safer. And he came on to talk about that after the Desmond Butler Washington Post articles on bodybuilding. One of the things that was in that kind of umbrella topic of some of the issues with modern enhanced bodybuilding, especially in the IFBB Pro League and the NPC, was safety. And we brought Guillermo on to talk about that. But Guillermo, if you haven't been paying attention, and shame on you if you haven't, has been publishing a ton of work in the area of bodybuilding. And what he did was he connected with the NASM to actually assemble what I'll describe as the all-star team for everyone in the evidence-based community for competitive bodybuilding to actually make a course. So you can get this. This is a NASM certification called the Physique and Bodybuilding Coach certification. So it is good for, I think, 2 continuing education units under NSCA. Of course, it's good for continuing education if you're a NASM trainer. But more importantly, if you're someone who works with anyone with body composition-related goals or competitive physique athletes, I basically wholeheartedly recommend this course. This is not some kind of weekend, quick hash together personal trainer course. I know that people in the evidence-based community have a mixed relationship with some of the personal training education materials out there, but I can tell you this one is I'm just really impressed, and a huge shout out to Brian Sutton and Casey DeJong, and of course Guillermo for putting this together because they reached out to everybody. So Guillermo reached out to me, and he gave me the honor of writing the Introduction to Physique Enhancement, Chapter 2, which I go through a lot. It's a pretty cool chapter. I not only talk about the history of physical culture and how we got to modern bodybuilding today, but what is the landscape of what's the landscape of the competitive environment? What divisions are available to people who want to compete in bodybuilding? What different organizations, both tested and untested, are available? And what is evidence-based practice? If you're going to be a coach, you need to understand that not only is the science important, but maybe even more so your experience and then the individual aspects of the client you're working with. So I go through evidence-based practice, I go through the landscape of competitive bodybuilding, and I also talk about things that people need to be aware of on the front end, some of the risks that are associated with bodybuilding. Bodybuilding, like most sports, is relatively extreme, and there are important mental health issues and issues related to body image and your relationship with food that should be screened for, that you need to have an awareness of your scope of practice, and you need to have support for your athletes with people with a better or broader or more specific, I should say, scope of practice. So anyway, I go all of that into Chapter 2. I talk about it there, and I was also a peer reviewer on this project. So I had the honor and privilege of peer reviewing all the programming chapters. So the chapter 16 that was on exercise programming, 17 on nutrition programming, and also 18 on peaking for competition or personal goals. So I had I would say the responsibility, and maybe even the duty, if you may say, I had a duty, and I take duty seriously. And I like to say the word duty. So I looked over those chapters to make sure that what we were actually recommending coaches do made sense and was based on the best available evidence. But it absolutely was not just a one-man show. There were a total of 19 chapters with 2 bonus chapters. I only authored 1 and I only peer-reviewed 3. But it's like I said, it's an all-star list of who is involved. We have Dr. Brandon Roberts. We have Dr. Eric Trexler. We have Lauren Conlon. You might recognize some of these names if you've been following the Iron Cult. We have Jesse Stapleton. We have IFBB pros involved. Andre Adams. We have Chris Barakat, who's been on the podcast. We have Scott Stevenson. We have Darren Willoughby, Dr. Darren Willoughby. Almost all of these are PhDs, by the way. Folks, many of these people have a PhD in exercise physiology or nutrition, specifically published in the area of bodybuilding, have been coaching for decades, are athletes themselves, sometimes pros, and are trainers. So they have all of the bases covered in terms of both practical and scientific knowledge. We got Dan Newmeyer, we got Adam Gonzalez, we got Dean St. Mart. We've got just really a who's who list. Connor Heffernan, actually peer-reviewed, who knows the physical culture historian who's been on Iron Culture multiple times. He peer-reviewed my chapter to make sure that the historical context was correct. And there's more, like I said. So I just encourage you to check that out if that's something you're interested in doing. It's a great way to enhance your education, your knowledge, and hopefully your practice and help more people. And I was really just pleased to be a part of it. So the links to that are going to be in the show notes. Full disclosure, I am an affiliate on this, which was something I did as just a way to try to promote it as well. So I do benefit if you decide to sign up and take this course. But with that said, I promoted this before I became an affiliate because it's just that good. And I wouldn't have said yes to the project and been an author if I didn't think it was worthwhile. So anyway, I will stop shamelessly plugging my own affiliate link for the NASM course, but I will just say that there's nothing else out there like it. It is a repository of evidence-based information on bodybuilding, and I think any physique coach should at least look through it and consider getting the certification. So moving on, we've got 2 topics today, both science-related. The first of which is going to be the topic of specificity. And talking about personal trainer education as a segue, you've probably heard of the SAID principle. That's specific adaptations to imposed demands, SAID. This is one of, depending on how it's presented, a plethora of exercise science principles that exercise science students learn in their first year, that is a part of every reputable personal training certification. And it is absolutely something that is a truism. But I don't mean to say that it's a truism in that, oh man, but it's not really true. And I know how common it is, the tropes online to say, hey, everything you thought you knew about X, Y, or Z is false, and then pitch you something. That is absolutely not what this segment's going to be. Everything you thought you knew about specificity is not wrong. However, doctors do hate me, and I do have one weird trick that will get you to your goals. No, I'm just kidding. But in all seriousness, I think people do miss the mark with specificity because of how it's conceptualized and then how they believe that concept applies to programming. And what it ends up being is people view this as a spectrum, and typically one of 2 spectrums, and with a little bit of confusion in between and how they interact. So one is from a movement perspective, that if we're trying to enhance, we'll use powerlifting as the example in this podcast. If we're trying to enhance a competition squat, then all the way to the left, but still has some transfer on the specificity spectrum of the movement, if you will, might be, say, a leg press, right? And then all the way to the right, the actual movement we're trying to enhance is a competition squat 1RM, right? The most you can lift for 1RM. That's going to transfer the most to what you're trying to do as a competitive powerlifter, which is squat the most weight you can on the platform to build your total. So, and then somewhere in between would be something like a different bar position. So if you squat low bar, a high bar, maybe a front squat, maybe something like a buffalo bar squat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Somewhere between, a front squat and a leg press might be something like a lunge. So obviously you could debate where different movements are on this quote unquote specificity spectrum, but that's the movement spectrum. But then also we have the load spectrum. So all the way on the right, again, most specific, we have that 100% of 1RM. We have a 10 RPE single, right? Then all the way on the left, we got just the bar. And then it just basically linearly goes up until you're at that max load. Now, as a concept, I think the spectrum is totally fine. And I think it's okay to view it that way. But people get into trouble when they start then making logical jumps from it, or what seem like logical jumps, but I would say are actually logical leaps, probably a leap too far, into programming. So I think the first thing we need to acknowledge is it becomes a little unclear as to what exactly is more or less specific when you think about the interaction between these two spectrums, which is a limitation of the spectrum view and why I don't actually use a spectrum conceptually when I think of it from a programming perspective. So as an example, what is more specific for a powerlifter? 80% of 1RM as a single, as a competition squat, or maxing out on a pin squat? Not so clear. One is a little more specific from a movement perspective, the competition squat, and then one is more specific to the load. And I think you can make arguments either way. But I think more importantly is we just have to realize that what is often taken from these spectrum views is that, okay, well, more specificity is always better. And while it's generally true that higher loads transfer to being stronger, and doing a movement is going to make you better at doing that movement, this isn't to say that that means all of your training should be heavy singles. And there's a reason why not everyone ends up going, yep, obviously I tried the Bulgarian method and that was great for me, and that's why I'm the strongest and everyone trains that way. And there are some people who hold the position that everyone should train that way. It would be better. And there was actually a time in my own personal training career, and to a limited extent to my athletes, but I tend to try things out on myself first and really kind of mull it over before I get a little more experimental with my clients, because the last thing I want to do is harm them. But there was a time in my career where I basically thought that if I could do more specific training as a powerlifter, it would be better. And probably the only saving grace for me, which prevented worse injuries than I've had, or worse burnout, or worse pain, is the fact that I am a bit of a multi-sport athlete. I like physique training just as much, if not more, than strength training, and I'm interested in multiple strength sports. So specificity for me is not exactly clear, and it's always restricted to a competition or a time domain, or where am I focused and interested at any given time. But nonetheless, when I have been in powerlifting phases, say sometime a decade ago, or even earlier than that, believe it or not, there were time points where I thought, you know what, if it weren't for this joint pain, if it weren't for this psychological burnout I'm experiencing, if it weren't for just this feeling of beat upness and not being well recovered, or at the time what I might have called CNS fatigue, I would be able to train more frequently with higher degrees of specificity, and that would be better. And it's actually just a necessary evil that I must, make these concessions and train less specifically. But hypothetically, if I could do more highly specific training, it would be better. Now, my understanding today, and what I'm going to talk about, is that that's an understandable perspective. And that seems to be something that these specificity spectrums imply, or that the said principle implies. But it's actually not. Just because we have a spectrum that suggests things are more specific on the right and less specific on the left does not immediately indicate what the dosage of that specificity should be. See, that was the error that I made. I thought, okay, well, if for every unit of training done to the right of the spectrum, I get more gains and more transfer to the competition lifts, then it's a waste of time for me to be doing things that are non-specific. But what if the dose you actually need of specific training to get a maximal benefit is actually quite low? Or what if the returns diminish so that it's not just okay, what's the transfer? And then that applies to every unit of training. But the more specific training you do, the less transfer you get for every unit, while in fact, the fatigue or the injury risk, perhaps, is something that continues to summate and accumulate, and it doesn't diminish. So that you're enhancing the risk to reward ratio, not the reward to risk ratio, the way you'd want it. And it actually becomes less worthwhile or even counterproductive. And you'd be better spent off with time after kind of satisfying that quota of specific training you'd benefit from doing something else. And indeed, when you look at the data, that's actually the story that I think it tells. And then if I was to take off my scientist hat and put on my coaching hat, I could give you many examples where having a more nuanced understanding of specificity would probably be to your benefit. So that's kind of the preamble, and let's start breaking it down. So I think the first thing to talk about is that principles of exercise science coexist with other principles of exercise science. There aren't any of them that are like a trump card that go, oh, well, this one supersedes this other principle. So, for example, you may have heard of the principle of individualization. This is the idea that people respond at individual rates and adapt to some degree individually to principles. Now, this doesn't violate the principle of specificity. It doesn't mean that if you go cycling, that's going to make you better at doing 1RMs because you're an individual, you're a unique snowflake, and cycling for you actually makes your 1RM squat get better. No, that's not the case. But it might say that you adapt at a slower or faster rate, or that unique themes on the programming style for you could be different for someone else, or that they may respond better to different volumes, frequencies, or intensities, or patterns of progression. So that is absolutely something true, and it matches on with the anecdotal experiences of most coaches, and there's actually data to support that. So that's just one example. Probably a lesser known principle, not necessarily of exercise science, but sometimes presented as a principle of motor learning, is a principle broadly called the principle of varied practice. Now, varied practice almost seems like, when I tell you more about what it is, that it's in a tug of war with specificity. So if we look at the motor learning research going all the way back actually to the mid-70s, there's a great amount of data that suggests that doing what's called varied practice enhances the rate of motor learning by leveraging what's called contextual interference, better than simply practicing the same skill over and over and over and over and over again. So there's a really good study by Chua and colleagues, and hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, that kind of discusses this in the discussion, but also shows it in their, it's a multi-experiment study. Not that common in general exercise science publications, but more common in neuroscience and motor learning and other fields. But nonetheless, this study by Chua and colleagues, titled "Practice Variability Promotes an External Focus of Attention and Enhances Motor Skill Learning," it has a great discussion. It cites some of the work that goes all the way back to the 70s, and it goes up till their own discussion, and they talk about the various ways that this has been shown in the research. And to give it a broad overview, essentially, there are many ways of comparing constant practice to varied practice. Sometimes it's presented as random practice, meaning that you do different variations on a skill in a random order rather than just doing it constantly. Sometimes it's promoted as blocked practice. So, hey, for this period of time, we're going to practice this variation of the skill, then we're going to do the skill itself, then we're going to do this variation in different blocks. Or sometimes it's presented as, I think, interleaved or interweaved, but all similar themes on the same topic of saying, hey, instead of just practicing the exact skill that we're trying to get better at, let's practice variations on that skill. And most of this research is done just like this specific study that came out in 2019 by Chua and colleagues on non-lifting tasks. So that is a limitation, and we're going to talk about that. So what Chua and colleagues specifically did was they looked at both golf putting and also a throwing task at a target. And what they did was they had groups doing both constant practice and then varied practice, where they simply changed the distance from the target. And then they surveyed the individuals about what their focus of attention was, how it got modified, and they also just looked at the rate of accuracy improvements, just who got better at the skill. And they found two things. For one, that simply using varied practice enhanced the motor skill learning. So those who used multiple variations of distance from the target, whether it was golf putting or a throwing task, got better at throwing or golf putting at a greater rate or a greater magnitude than the group that just practiced from one fixed position. They also noticed that their focus of attention was more in line with what we think is based in evidence for what's going to enhance performance. So they had a more external focus of attention. So for those who don't know, an internal focus or an external focus, we often talk about them in lifting as internal or external cues. So an internal cue would be to tell you to focus on something in your body. That would be like saying, hips under the bar, right? That's telling you something to pay attention internally to your body. However, something like push the floor away, and that's something outside of you, that is an external cue, right? Or try to push the bar through the ceiling. That's an external cue. Now, generally, the data suggests that for performance, for improving velocity or force output, for example, or even sometimes the actual motor pattern qualitative aspects itself, an external focus is better than an internal focus. That doesn't mean you should never use internal cues, especially for things like bodybuilding, single joint movements. There has been data to suggest that might enhance your ability to recruit the target muscles in certain contexts, but that's a discussion for another day. But nonetheless, the individuals who used different distances for the throwing and putting tasks in Chua, they basically found that they got better at the task faster, as well as had a more external focus. And if you think about it, if you were only ever practicing a task from a single fixed distance, you don't get to have as much calibration around trying to hit the target. You're thinking about more of what you're doing because the task is what's called a more closed task rather than an open task. However, if you're throwing from, say, 10 meters away, then 15 meters away, then 5 meters away, you're having to think about that target external to you, the distance from you, and how you're going to modify your throwing action. So there's a little more of an external focus, which might be part of the reason why it enhances motor learning. Now, Chua is absolutely not the first one who has observed this benefit of varied practice. They are one of the few pieces of research that tries to examine a possible mechanism, that focus being more external. But they're absolutely not the first study that showed the benefit of varied practice. Like I said, this research goes all the way back to the 70s, and we've got literally, multiple decades of data finding the same thing, that in sporting tasks many times, whether that's cutting, whether that's shooting free throws, whether that's throwing darts, whether that's putting in golf, or whether it's jumping tasks, that using forms of varied practice enhances the rate of motor learning. So, indeed, the question is, well, does this apply to lifting? And there's a couple of different critiques as to, you could say, maybe why it's not. First off, we have very little data on lifting. We don't have none, which I'll talk about in a second. And lifting is generally a closed task. So in sports, we have open and closed tasks, and in just life, we have open and closed tasks. Generally, open motor skills are ones that are performed in a more dynamic environment. You're cutting not to move around a fixed obstacle, but because an opponent is coming at you from a specific direction. You are deciding to turn the wheel on your bike because you're doing dirt bike racing and there is a puddle or there's a pothole, rather than, say, just cycling on a fixed track that isn't moving very much, right? You are deciding to do a fake before you shoot in basketball because your opponent's coming at you. So the environment is changing. There's an opponent. You're reacting to something. However, in a task like, say, archery or high jump or weightlifting or powerlifting, it's comparatively, relatively more closed. The task stays the same and only just one variable changes. You have to jump over a higher bar in high jump. You have to lift a heavier weight in weightlifting or powerlifting. And you could postulate that perhaps, hey, you don't need or you don't benefit as much from varied practice for closed tasks. Because some of the theories behind varied practice is that when you get to practice variations on a skill, you more, if you will, finally groove that motor pattern and make it both resilient, but also have the ability to react to different stimuli. You have a more complete version of that skill that is robust to dynamic changes in the environment. And maybe that just doesn't matter in powerlifting. And I think that's a fair hypothesis. However, I would say that there is data on relatively closed skills showing the benefit of varied practice. And I think it's also worth talking about that that's not the only reason that varied practice might be beneficial. I mentioned earlier the concept of contextual interference, which you may or may not have heard of. If you're not studying in the area of motor science, this also comes up in the science of learning. Now, contextual interference is exactly what it sounds like. It is the context of the skill or task you're trying to learn changing and, quote unquote, interfering with the task. An example would be that, let's say you take someone, you bring them into the gym and they're trying to learn how to do bench press. You teach them how to bench. Here's how you set your arch. Here's how you press. Here's the bar path you want. Here's when you hold your breath, plant your feet, don't lift your head up, yada, yada, yada. And then you go, okay, you got that down? And then the lifter goes, yeah, I think I got that down. You go, sweet. I'm now going to teach you to throw darts. And the person goes, what? Why would you do that? And they're trying to remember how to bench, and now all of a sudden they're learning to throw darts, and you're teaching them how to throw darts, and then you go, sweet, now that you've got throwing darts down to a basic level, let's go back to benching. And the person goes, but I forgot the things you just told me. This is going to be hard. I have to re-remember what you taught me and re-ingrain those skills. And that's exactly what contextual interference does, and why, in the long run, it's beneficial. Because while initially it makes you worse at the task that you're coming back to, if you were to compare it in a very acute trial, in the long run, the actual act of re-remembering improves the cognitive task, I would say, solidification to your motor cortex. You get better at actually ingraining that motor pattern precisely because you had to re-remember it. That cognitive task of re-remembering the skill you're trying to learn embeds it more deeply and enhances the rate of motor learning. So this doesn't mean that we have to use different variations of lifts if we were to apply this to lifting. You can see the principle of varied practice leveraged in various ways. So those who are familiar with the Chico-esque programming style, if you ran one of these templates that was available online that was supposedly, written by Chico, or it might have been, slightly modified or not exactly what you thought it was. But nonetheless, this style of programming, everyone's familiar with it. It is a schema that we understand. You will often come in and do squat and then bench, and then you come back to not deadlift, but squats again. So you're actually having to focus on bench press between sets of squats. That's one example of being able to leverage contextual interference without having variations on the main lifts. Another example is the fact that, again, we have two different ways of conceiving of specificity, not just movement, but also loads. So if you look at some of the data on daily undulating programming or daily undulating periodization, I prefer programming because it's really more about the short term in the microcycle to mesocycle length, but I digress. There's a 2017 meta-analysis by Williams and colleagues that found that periodized programs tend to perform better in both untrained and trained individuals than non-periodized. And even more so, they found a beneficial effect of undulating programs over linear programs. Now, undulating programs, they have more variation in load on a day-to-day basis, daily undulating programming. It just means that the rep ranges vary, okay? Some people have hypothesized, and you can even find it in the discussion in Williams a little bit, that perhaps what's going on here is leveraging the benefits of varied practice. Because you could argue that a light load or a heavy load are actually different motor tasks. They require different force output. They might require different degrees of activation of the synergist muscles involved, or different degrees of co-activation, or lesser degrees of antagonist activation, and they do qualitatively feel different. If you think about doing a single at 70% of 1RM, you probably do it a little different, or at least it feels kinesthetically different than, say, a 90% of 1RM squat, bench, or deadlift. So indeed, it may not be the fact that you're doing, say, 10 reps on one day versus 4 or 3 reps on another day, but that the loads vary, and therefore some aspect of the kinematics vary, so that therefore you're leveraging varied practice. You have a different blocked practice, another form of varied practice, on different days. And that might be why it's a little bit better than, say, something like a linear approach where you're staying in a more fixed rep range for a longer period of time. Those are both potential hypothetical ways of suggesting, hey, varied practice might apply to lifting. But we don't have to hang out in the hypothetical, because obviously that meta-analysis by Williams didn't say, we know that the mechanism by which daily undulating programming was a little bit better is varied practice. We don't have that. But there are hints, and I would say stronger hints in the research. So there's a paper that came out in 2014 by Fonseca and colleagues titled "Changes in Exercises Are More Effective Than in Loading Schemes to Improve Muscle Strength." And what they did is they varied two factors in these groups that were training. First off, really important to point out, these are untrained individuals. So that is a limitation of the study. Okay, so that's up front. But it doesn't mean that this doesn't tell you something about learning, because obviously untrained individuals do need to learn. Second limitation, they didn't use barbell back squats, they used Smith machine squats. And that'll be important later as I describe how complexity of movement also impacts specificity. But nonetheless, they varied two factors. They varied the movement selection, the exercise selection, and they also varied load. So they had groups that performed all of their volume only on Smith machine squats, and then they had groups that performed all of their loading in one specific load zone, so one specific rep and load combination, and they had a group that varied it. And they found that in these different combinations, these groups performed in a way that would indicate that perhaps the principle of varied practice enhances strength development. Indeed, the group that varied both the movement and also varied the load range did the best. So instead of performing only the squat on all days of training, They split their volume equally between 4 movements: the Smith machine squat, the deadlift, the leg press, and the lunge, and they also varied the load on different days. That group, with varied exercise selection and varied loading, made the best strength gains. After that was the group that varied the movement but kept the same load. After that was the group that kept only the Smith machine squat in, all their volume with the Smith machine squat, but varied the loading. And then finally, the group that still made gains, but made the poorest gains out of the 4, maintained the same load and did all of their volume on the Smith machine squat. Now, if we were to think about the principle of specificity as that movement spectrum and as that load spectrum, that doesn't make sense. You're thinking, hold on, I'm better off doing more of my volume with the specific task I'm trying to get better at. But that's not what Fonseca found. In fact, it suggested that varied practice was more important. Now, like I said, the limitation of this study is that a Smith machine squat is not nearly as complex of a movement as a barbell squat, and also untrained individuals are really learning something for the first time when you put them in a study like this, so perhaps this doesn't apply to someone who has a more ingrained movement pattern. And I think that's a fair critique, but ultimately I don't think the data supports it, and I'll explain why. But to back up what I said, the reason why the Smith machine squat is a limitation is if we look at a study by Rossi and colleagues, Strength, Body Composition, and Functional Outcomes in the Squat versus Leg Press Exercises, this is a really good example of how specificity is more complex than just do the thing you're trying to get better at. What they did was they had 3 groups, and they performed the same total volume in terms of sets, but one group did all squats, one group did all leg press, and one group split their time between the leg press and the squats. Now, on the squat, the principle of specificity was leveraged very clearly. The squat-only group made the biggest gains in the squat. However, the squat/leg press group didn't make a significant difference from that group, but it was percentage-wise less. They improved about 20% versus 35%. And the leg press-only group made significantly less gains than the squat group. So in Rossi and colleagues, if you look at the squat 1RM data, you're thinking, oh, more time squatting, I get better at the squat. And perhaps the leg press is not enough of a useful variation to count as varied practice, and it is a waste of time. But when you look at the leg press 1RM data, it tells a different story. All 3 groups had very similar increases in the range of 30 to 35% increase in 1RM by the end of the study, regardless if they did all of their time leg pressing, half of their time leg pressing, or didn't leg press at all and only squatted. So not only is the spectrum concept perhaps a little limited as it also interacts with load, but the complexity of the movement and perhaps the training status of the individual will also modify it. So right there, we're seeing that there's elements of the said principle that, the way we see it online in typical kind of meme-based specificity arguments is both true and untrue. So, like I said, Fonseca and colleagues are probably the closest data we have in lifting suggesting that varied practice might enhance the rate of motor learning and that actual movement variation is more important than load variation. And that's kind of some of the data-based argument that I would make. But I think it's also worth talking about that logical leap that I said that's probably not so logical. When we look at the specificity spectrum and we think, okay, we're getting more out of every unit of specific training than non-specific training, maybe not. Or maybe if that is true, it's only true to a point before it starts becoming redundant and then even counterproductive. And actually, there's data to support that as well. So there's a study by Lima and colleagues titled Planned Load Reduction versus Fixed Load, a strategy to reduce the perception of effort with similar improvements in hypertrophy and strength. That's a 2018 study. And what they found was they compared 3 groups. All 3 groups used the same load on their first set of 3. Okay, so they used this reasonably heavy load, they did a set, and then one group maintained that load and did 2 more sets, and the other 2 groups dropped the load by either 5% or 10%. Interestingly enough, all 3 groups made similar strength gains, or I should say they weren't significantly different from one another. The only difference between groups was that the 10% load reduction group actually had lower perceived exertion, so it felt easier, which makes sense, they're lifting a lighter weight. But notably, this indicates that it is not the total volume with the most specific thing you're doing, that is the peak load, but the fact that you got exposed to it at all. So indeed, this indicates, and there's data to support it, that it is the load exposure, the intensity of training, if you will, the load I think is probably more appropriate, than it is the volume done with that load that is going to transfer the most, that is most important. meaning that specificity both works, but it's also powerful, and we probably don't need very much. And I think one study, absolutely not enough to make that conclusion, but there's not just one study. We actually have a great meta-analysis that was published in 2017 by Ralston and colleagues. If you're an Iron Cold fan, and especially if you've been following the bodybuilding literature that's come out in the last few years, you might be familiar with Dr. Brad Schoenfeld's meta-analysis on hypertrophy and its relationship with sets per week per muscle group. And just as a reminder, they found basically a relationship where there was an increase in the rates of hypertrophy or the magnitude of muscle growth as someone increased the number of sets per week per muscle group from the 1 to 4 categorization to the 5 to 9 to the 10 plus. That's a pretty well-known meta-analysis in our space. A slightly less well-known meta-analysis is this one by Ralston. It was done the same year in 2017, and they used the same design. They used the same categorization. So they had 1 to 4, 5 to 9, and 10 plus sets per exercise per week. And they were looking at the relationship between volume and increases in 1RM strength. Now, they found slightly different results. So first off, when you look at the actual studies included, the different set categorizations, 1 to 4, 5 to 9, and 10 plus was actually just 10 to 12, because there was no studies that were meta-analyzed that did more than 12 sets per week on an exercise. So the first thing you'll notice when you look at this meta-analysis was that they compared 1 to 4 to 5 to 12. They had to combine the moderate and the high volume groups together because there wasn't enough data. And when you look at the effect sizes associated with doing the moderate 5 to 9 sets per week with the 10 plus 10 to 12 sets per week, they were nearly identical. One was 0.98, the moderate, and then one was 1.01. So functionally identical standardized mean differences that are associated, or standardized effect sizes that are associated with moderate and high volumes of training for strength. So they combined those. So their primary comparisons was 1 to 4 versus 5 to 12 sets. And there was actually a significant difference favoring higher volumes, but the effect sizes were almost all trivial or just barely small. So when we have standardized effect sizes, generally if using a Hedges G or a Cohen's D, what they are classified into is that 0.2 to 0.49 is small, 0.5 to 0.79 is medium, and 0.8 or higher is large. So we're looking at effect sizes in the 0.5 to 0.2 range. So these are trivial effect sizes, meaning that there's not much of a difference between doing 1 to 4 sets or 5 to 12, indicating that, again, it is the peak intensity or the peak load that's going to have the larger impact on strength gains than the amount of volume you do with it. So like I said, Ralston and colleagues, great meta-analysis. Make sure you check it out. It's open access, and it kind of confirms what that study by Lima that came out in 2018 was hinting at with their load reduction study. So there's a fair amount of data indicating that you don't need to do a ton of volume with highly specific work to get a pretty good gain. And again, I think the remaining criticism here is that, okay, but these are not necessarily all trained lifters. And in fact, I think 5 out of the 9 studies included in Ralston were untrained lifters. But that happened back in 2017, and there's been more data since. And I want to remind you all of what happened when we brought Pack on, Dr. Pack, Dr. Androulakis Korakakis. He actually did some really cool work specifically in powerlifters. And I would encourage you to check out when we had him on, but I will very briefly go over some of the research he did. He was investigating the minimum effective dose in powerlifters. And probably the most relevant study was the one where he compared groups doing different versions of a minimum effective dose protocol. He used a baseline approach of a 2-3-1, and that's the frequency on the squat, bench, and deadlift. So squatting twice per week, benching 3 times per week, or deadlifting once per week. And each time what they would do is they would come in and they'd work up to a 9 or a 9.5. So like a training max, a heavy single. And then they would do 2 sets of 3 at 80% of that max load on that lift, and that was it. So that means in the course of the week, the number of working reps, these are reps, not sets, was 14 on bench, 14 on squat, 21 on bench, and 7 on deadlift. That's a very low volume program. However, that group made significant gains in 6 weeks. And to determine what was a significant gain, they actually did interviews with the best powerlifting coaches in the IPF and some of the highest level elite athletes and asked them, hey, what is a reasonable rate of strength gain that you perceive to be substantial over 6 weeks? Because that's how long the study was. And they also cross-reference that with Open Powerlifting, which is a database of all powerlifting results in legitimate federations. I should say any actual registered federation, and to make sure that they pass the data sniff test, if you will. And not only did that 2-3-1 plus back-off group make what was considered substantial gains, they actually exceeded them. So this is actually a win for specificity. It says, hey, all these folks did was the competition deadlift, squat bench deadlift, with pretty low volume. Like I said, 21 total reps on bench per week, 14 total reps on squat, and only 7 reps on deadlift. They actually exceeded what coaches and elite level athletes thought was a meaningful increase in strength. So then the question becomes, okay, if that's all that's needed from a specificity standpoint, what happens if you do more? And the answer is probably not much. It probably doesn't benefit you. And that's the thing that I think we really need to hang our hat on here, is there's only so much we can benefit from specific work. And this has been shown also in other trained lifters. So there's a fantastic paper, came out back in 2006. It's one I remember being fundamental to my understanding of exercise science and the relationship between volume and intensity. And it's by Gonzalez-Badillo and colleagues. And it's titled Moderate Volume of High Relative Training Intensity Produces Greater Strength Gains Compared to the Low and High Volumes in Competitive Weightlifters. So what they did was they took, I think, roughly 30 junior competitive weightlifters. These are young, athletic individuals trained, competing in weightlifting, and they broke them into 3 groups. And the differences between these groups was the proportion of their training done at the 90 to 100% of 1RM range. And essentially in each group, they doubled what the other group did in terms of the total reps over this 10-week period. So it's a longer study as well, which I think is useful, done at this very high intensity. Again, 90% of 1RM to 100% of 1RM. And they were doing this on the snatch, squat, clean and jerk. And those 3 lifts were the tested lifts, but they also did it in their variations like pulls and whatnot. So they had a generally favorable effect for the low and moderate groups. Notably, only the squat improved in the high relative volume of high intensity work group. They improved their squat, but they did not significantly improve their snatch or clean and jerk. However, the low and moderate proportions of high intensity work groups improved not only their squat, but also their clean and jerk. Furthermore, I think it's important to talk about the magnitude of change. When you look at the moderate group, they had roughly a 10% increase in strength in their clean and jerk and squat, while the high proportion of their volume at a high intensity group increased their squat strength by, I think, around 7%. So overall, it suggests that doing more and more and more of your volume at a very high intensity doesn't necessarily benefit you, and it may actually be counterproductive. That's just from a performance perspective. Now, to give you the amount of work they actually did, the low proportion of high-intensity work group did 46 total lifts. That's the number of reps in that 90 to 100% of 1RM range. And then it was 93 in the moderate group and 184 in that high-intensity proportion group. So this study actually suggests doing too much is counterproductive. It'll slow down your rate of strength gain. But that's just from a performance perspective. I think it's also worth talking about injury and burnout. So I don't think I need a study to support this, although there is research that I'm not going to cite because it's not necessary to indicate it. But doing compound free weight lower body lifts with high intensity is pretty mentally fatiguing, especially when you consider comparing it to something like a single joint or machine-based movement. And it's really important to remember that we train for strength and we look at these studies that are 6 to 12 weeks long, but we're not necessarily considering what is going to increase our strength in the long run. So when we look at data on what is associated with strength in high-level lifters, so what discriminates between higher performers in powerlifting, weightlifting, and strongman, there are a number of studies that find pretty strong relationships cross-sectionally, which is a limitation, I'll admit, but it's very difficult to do a 10-year-long study, with strength and indices of muscle mass. So either cross-sectional area, muscle thickness, or lean body mass. On Stronger by Science, Greg has written a couple articles about this on the relationship between strength and size, which I would encourage you to check out. We'll have that in the show notes. Thank you, Kai. But nonetheless, it's pretty well established at this point, and most people agree in the area of exercise science, that bigger muscles produce more force and are associated with better performance. So there should probably be a focus on getting bigger over time. And we know that you can get bigger doing highly specific work. The squat, the bench, and the deadlift certainly can be vehicles for muscle growth. And certainly you can do more sets with lower rep, heavier load sets, and make some good gains. But we've known for a while now that sets need to last a certain amount of time. Typically, they need to be right around that, say, 4 to 6 rep length for those sets to be on equal footing if they're at a similar proximity to failure to sets that have more reps. Schoenfeld and colleagues showed in one of their studies that a group doing 2 to 4 RM training, 3 sets, made poorer gains than a group doing 8 to 12 RM training for hypertrophy specifically. Of course, the 2 to 4 RM group made better strength gains, but in terms of hypertrophy, which is not an issue in the short term, but might be in the long term, they were not able to make as much muscle growth using those shorter, higher intensity sets. They probably just don't last long enough to actually put some fatigue on the fibers that are producing high tension. However, there's other data by Mangine and colleagues that actually found in the 3 to 5 RM range, probably on average 4 reps or 5 reps, unclear if you look at the methods, the differences weren't very significant between groups, and in fact, the lower rep group did better. There were differences in rest periods, but nonetheless, the data suggests that perhaps right around, say, 5 rep sets or higher are needed to make those sets on equal footing to higher rep sets from a stimulus for hypertrophy perspective. So that means if you want to grow off of doing a whole bunch of heavy work with the big three, you have to do more sets. And that's been shown multiple times. Schoenfeld actually, in a classic study in 2014, showed in volume match conditions that if you did 7 by 3 versus 3 by 10 on various movements, you could get similar hypertrophy when volume was not significantly different between groups. So if you want to spend twice as much time in the gym doing triples, sure, you can get the muscle growth that you would get from doing sets of 8 to 12. But is that the most efficient way to gain muscle? You have to actually make the argument that there's something qualitatively different about the growth you'd get in your quads doing triples on squats versus, say, doing sets of 8 on leg press. That could be true, but I haven't seen any data to suggest that's the case. And I think that the likelihood of that being true is probably pretty low. So what this means is that it probably behooves powerlifters, weightlifters, anyone trying to get stronger to include hypertrophy work in their training for their long-term strength potential, right? Because they want to increase muscle size. And if they're going to do that, then why would they corner themselves doing highly specific work and needing to do 7 sets of 3 as an example or something like that? Trying to get the best of both worlds, but not realizing that those sets are much harder. They're more challenging. They're also arguably could actually be a higher risk of injury. Now, I'm not going to firmly claim this, and I'm not going to say that unpacking the etiology and the causes of injury is easy. I would get crucified by barbell medicine and everyone else, and I'm not saying that. But what I will simply do is report the data. And when you look at a great compilation of injury rates in barbell sports that was done by Keogh and Winwood, and that was published, I believe, back in 2017, and that's the epidemiology of injuries across the weight training sports, you can see that bodybuilders in most reports have substantially lower injury rates than both weightlifters and powerlifters. And what are bodybuilders doing compared to powerlifters? They do variations of squat, bench, and deadlift, but they do more reps, various different rep ranges, more exercise variation, and they also include machine work. So at least one or multiple or all of those factors is probably leading to the lower injury rates. Perhaps, not sure. Obviously, we don't have causation from this epidemiology of injuries study, but I think it is interesting. So we know that both from anecdotal experience and research, heavy compound lifts, especially lower body compound lifts, are simply harder. They feel harder. You'll have higher perceived exertion if you just remove the rep range as a factor and just think of the actual modality of training. We also know that bodybuilders have lower injury rates than their strength athlete cousins, if you will. And we also know from multiple studies that doing a higher and higher proportion of your volume as higher intensity work doesn't necessarily enhance strength gain. We have the Ralston meta-analysis, and we also have the study that looked at this more directly in junior weightlifters by Gonzalez Badillo. So the picture that I'm painting here is that yes, specificity is powerful, but it's so powerful that you only need some. And it does also have diminishing returns to the point where there's actually trade-offs. And if you talk to me now as a coach instead of a scientist, I can tell you that it really doesn't make sense to paint with too broad of brushstrokes with the principle of specificity, because you start invalidating other principles like individuality. If you are a specificity proponent and you think you're being evidence-based, but everyone you give training to follows a very similar program of do more of the squat, bench, and deadlift, do more volume, or always max out, or just go heavy, and you don't use any variations and you don't modify things, that's really just a cookie cutter program that you're kind of painting over and going, principle of specificity. And that doesn't make a lot of sense from a coaching perspective. And sometimes things that seem more generally less specific on those spectrums that I talked about earlier can actually be more specific to the individual problem at hand. So a couple of things to bring up. One anecdotal experience I've had as a coach is that I can reliably fix someone's grip issue that might be holding back their deadlift, not by giving them more heavy deadlift days, which, based upon the principle of specificity as a spectrum argument, would be saying, hey, the most specific way to increase your grip strength on a max deadlift is to do max deadlifts. Instead, I have them do heavy barbell holds out of the rack, just an inch or two below their lockout. So they only have to do a very partial rack pull and then simply hold the heaviest weight they can for an amount of time that's similar to the amount of time they might spend on a max deadlift. And this has reliably fixed people's grip issues and unlocked their ability to deadlift more, not by doing more deadlifts and not by incurring the fatigue associated with doing more heavy deadlifts, but by doing something that's relatively innocuous. And I'm sure you can think of many other examples. But also from the hypertrophy perspective, think about it this way. Deadlifts done in the competition style, we don't have much control over the eccentric. So you're really only getting about half the volume for your posterior chain. So if you need to develop bigger hamstrings, glutes, and lower back, it might make sense to do RDLs or to do higher rep sets on deadlifts with straps while controlling the eccentric. Similarly, on the bench press, let's say you've got a great arch and you do wide grip bench and you've just barely met the legal criteria that's now new in the IPF for depth on bench. Well, that's great. That's probably going to enhance your bench press strength right now and allow you to lift more on the platform. But how is that going to impact your pec, triceps, and shoulder growth, considering that now you've reduced the range of motion and also changed the muscle length that you're training at? Now at the bottom of a bench press, you're actually not stretching the pec very much or the tricep or the delt. It might behoove you, if you want to enhance your long-term hypertrophy and increase your strength ceiling, to do things like dips or flat back dumbbell press or feet up bench press with a closer grip. So these are all examples where you can see that being more specific might only help in the short run, or it might only help generally, but not for a specific scenario. And I would argue that in these cases where you have, say, an underdeveloped upper body and a plateaued bench, or an underdeveloped posterior chain and a plateaued deadlift, or a deadlift that's being held back by weak grip strength, the more specific thing to do for that individual is something directly for that problem, even though it might seem less specific on that general spectrum. So folks, I'll leave it there. Those are some of my thoughts on specificity. And generally, I would say that remember that the principle of specificity, while true, it doesn't invalidate motor learning principles like the principle of varied practice. And it doesn't invalidate the principle of individuality. And ultimately, I think we can all think of instances where it might be a better idea to think logically, what is the easiest way for me to correct X issue? And maybe we should deal with them on a case-by-case basis and not get bought into dogmatic or ideological perspectives on how we should train. And there may be benefit just out of this simple, sheer, varied practice to having different variations on the lifts, especially when you're further from competition. Something that I will do to leverage what I think is the potential benefits of varied practice with my lifters is just ask them, what equipment access do they have? And what movements are a little more comfortable for them? So if they find that their hips tend to have a little bit less pain or ache in them when they do high bar squats or safety bar squats, and we're also further from competition, I'll absolutely change one of their squat days to a safety bar squat. Not because I think there's necessarily something magic about a safety bar squat, but more so because it's a variation. They're further from competition. It may enhance motor learning, and at the very least, they'll enjoy it and it'll give their hips a break. And I know from the data on varied practice, and I understand that from the distance from competition and the fact that the quads are going to grow because they're a similar stimulus to a low bar squat, even though they're not a low bar squat, that these things could all actually have a potential benefit. So like I said, I'll leave it there, and we're going to move on and just cover briefly some of the new diet break data. So yes, like I said, out of Dr. Bill Campbell's lab, new study published by Seidler and colleagues in the Journal of Human Kinetics. We'll have a link to the PDF that Kai is going to put there in the show notes if you want to read the full text. And it's titled "The Effects of Intermittent Diet Breaks During 25% Energy Restriction on Body Composition and Resting Metabolic Rate in Resistance-Trained Females, a Randomized Controlled Trial." So brief overview of what diet breaks are, just for anyone who's not been paying attention. But first, I would recommend you definitely check out the episode of Iron Culture where we had Dr. Grant Tinsley and Dr. Jackson Pios on. I myself was really privileged to be a part of Dr. Jackson Pios' PhD work, where he did actually the first research on diet breaks in resistance-trained individuals, specifically resistance-trained athletes. And these findings are quite similar, and they kind of reinforce his findings. But this is just the third recent study we've had in this population on this topic, and actually two of them are from the same group. So anyway, diet breaks. What the heck are they? Well, diet breaks, for those who don't know, generally they sit on a spectrum of what I would describe as nonlinear or intermittent dieting strategies, where we are manipulating the frequency and the length of time spent in an energy deficit. So you might have heard of, say, a cheat meal. This means that one of your meals you're eating typically whatever the hell you want and eating a whole lot, and it ends up taking the whole day into not being a deficit. But they could be applied such that your calories are just higher on that day and you're having a large meal. Over a little bit more on the spectrum is, say, 1-day refeeds, where you're eating at maintenance or maybe higher for 1 day per week. And you can have 2-day refeeds, maybe 3-day refeeds. And then at a certain point, we're probably looking at what we'd call a break from the diet, or a diet break. And in practice, these typically last 1 week most of the time, sometimes 2 weeks, or sometimes even a little bit longer. And the idea here, I should say the hypothesis, and what people have observed anecdotally and why they like to use them, and we'll talk about what the actual data confirms or disconfirms, is that maybe these help with fat loss, they help with muscle preservation, they take you out of a state of low energy availability, maybe push back some of the symptoms of REDS, ultimately making fat loss and muscle retention more efficient, maybe correcting or bringing back some of the metabolic adaptations so that you can burn more calories afterwards. You'll see various hypotheses around these, but overall, anecdotal experiences, and I will put my hand up and say that at 3DMJ, we've had these anecdotal experiences, is that some of these strategies seem to really help with the process of fat loss in different contexts, okay? Now, the first time the concept of diet breaks really kind of popped on the radar was a study by Wing that came out back in 2000, I want to say 3. Sometimes I get that wrong. No, it is 2003. Just looked it up. Wing and Jeffrey. The title of that study was "Prescribed Breaks as a Means to Disrupt Weight Control Efforts." Now, the interesting thing about this study is they tried to look at what happens when people break their diet. They went like, hey, look, people are great at losing weight until they're not, and we want to understand more about what causes people to fail on their diets. So what they did was they did an outpatient, ecologically valid but not super laboratory controlled style study, where they went to kind of like a behavioral weight loss clinic. Think like Weight Watchers, where people go to a group, they weigh in, and they are, purposely on their own trying to lose weight, and they weigh in and they talk about that experience, and they get guidance in these group-led sessions on how to continue losing weight, right? So what they did is they attended these sessions, they recorded people's weight, and they just looked at the progression of weight loss. And then in 2 of the groups, they simply instructed them to not go to these meetings and to not attempt to purposely lose weight for different periods. So this is a 20-week study. And one group did a diet break for 6 weeks in the middle, and another group did 3 2-week breaks. So 2 of these 2 groups took 6 weeks off of dieting out of this 20-week period. But an interesting thing happened is that by the end of the study, they'd all lost, all 3 groups, the groups that continually dieted, supposedly, for 20 weeks, and the group that took a 6-week break, and the group that took 3 2-week breaks, they got to the same place in terms of scale weight lost, which is really interesting. So anyway, that was back in 2003, and then the kind of collective awareness in the evidence-based community was relatively just kind of waiting for something to happen. And then while there were some other studies, the big splash was a study by Byrne and colleagues. They did the quote-unquote Matador study, titled "Intermittent Energy Restriction Improves Weight Loss Efficiency in Obese Men, the Matador Study." That came out in 2018. And this had pretty intense findings. What they did was they used something more akin to the approaches that we use in the kind of bodybuilding world. They had just a 2-week diet break, not that one with the 6 weeks in the middle, but they did it a little differently than we might do it. They did 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. And they had a group that took just a 16-week continuous diet versus the group that did interspersed 2 weeks off from dieting between 2 weeks of dieting. So it took a total of 30 weeks for them to finish the intervention to have the same amount of time spent in a deficit. Now, this was a far more controlled study than the one by Wing and colleagues. They tested folks' metabolic rate. They gave them, they actually gave them food, so it's still an outpatient study, but they controlled it best as possible. And they had them eat at maintenance based upon their testing, and looked at weigh-ins and, compared to the resting energy expenditure measurements, provided the food for them to enhance adherence. And the findings at the end of the study were pretty impressive. The group on the diet break, the men with obesity, lost 50% more fat mass, and they also had a better retention of body mass, body composition corrected resting energy expenditure. And probably most importantly, which not enough people talk about, is that at a 6-month follow-up after these, the 16-week dieting or 30-week dieting period in the diet break group, the weight regain was much more in the group that was continuous. And there was actually 90% more fat loss in the diet break group than in the group that had done continuous dieting at the 6-month follow-up, largely driven by the fact that the continuous dieters regained a lot of their weight loss, unfortunately. So something happened that improved long-term weight loss retention. Now, this was something that I think took a lot of people by surprise because of how pretty impressive the magnitude of the findings were. And to me, I was like, oh, maybe this validates what we've been seeing at 3DMJ with diet breaks, improving things. But we really do need to do more research on resistance trained individuals and in leaner individuals. And that's where Dr. Jackson Pio stepped in and he tapped me on the shoulder and said, hey, I'd love to get your perspective on this. And he did a whole PhD on this. And he's now published 2 studies. Both came out in 2021. One is titled A 1-Week Diet Break Improves Muscle Endurance During an Intermittent Dieting Regime in Adult Athletes, a pre-specified secondary analysis of the ICE CAP trial. And then the main study was Continuous versus Intermittent Dieting for Fat Loss and Fat-Free Mass Retention in Resistance-Trained Adults, the ICE CAP trial. So basically what Dr. Pios did, and what I had the privilege of contributing to, was replicating this with a slightly more ecologically valid approach in athletes, resistance-trained athletes. And what they did was that every 3 weeks, they had a 1-week intervention. 1-week diet break in their intervention versus the 2 on, 2 off approach that Byrne and colleagues took. And this time there was one group that did 12 weeks into continuous dieting, and the other group did 4-by-3-week diets with the 1-week diet breaks in between. So it took them 15 weeks to get through the full intervention. And of course, 3 of those weeks were spent at maintenance calories. And interestingly enough, what was found by Pios and colleagues was that overall, body composition, not significantly different. Performance, not significantly different. And resting energy expenditure, not significantly different. So they did not find the same thing that Byrne and colleagues had. And that kind of created a big However, they did find some interesting things. There was an increase in diet satisfaction and an increase in the satiety hormone peptide YY in the group doing the diet breaks. And there was a decrease in hunger and desire to eat in the diet break group. So it seemed like the ability to adhere and the physiological, in some cases, sensations of hunger and satiety were better in the diet break group, but the physiological differences for performance and body composition were not there. Like I mentioned, there was 2 studies that Pios did. One was a secondary analysis, just looking at the 1-week period. Now, interestingly enough, during the diet break itself, during the 1-week diet breaks, it was interesting that body mass did go up. Fat-free mass, according to the measurements that were taken, did go up, probably related to glycogen. And resting energy expenditure also increased, as did lower body muscular endurance during the diet break. However, those things didn't summate over the course of all the diet breaks to result in superior improvements in body composition or performance for the diet break group. So it might have been that they lost whatever they gained, and these were transient effects during these 1-week periods. But interestingly enough, so indeed, what people feel during diet breaks, that I'm performing better, I might look a little fuller, I feel like I'm burning more calories, I'm not as hungry. All that is true. However, it doesn't necessarily add up over time. Now, that's where we were at as of 2021. with POs coming in and throwing kind of a wrench in the happy parade that we had on diet breaks from Byrne and colleagues results. And now we have this study published out of Bill Campbell's lab by Seidler and colleagues, which I mentioned. Now, this was 6 weeks continuous dieting versus 3x2 weeks of dieting with a couple 1-week diet breaks in between. So 8 weeks versus 6 weeks total. And this time, pretty cool, in 38 resistance trained women. Now, this time, again, the findings of POs seem to be confirmed. No significant differences in body composition or resting energy expenditure. So, at least in this group, didn't seem to pan out that so we were going, okay, well, is it Byrne and colleagues results or is it POs and colleagues results that are more likely to be the case? It seems like POs and colleagues. And interestingly enough, there was also greater disinhibition in the continuous dieting group. That actually increased over time, while disinhibition slightly decreased in the diet break group. Now, if you're wondering, what is disinhibition? Disinhibition is the tendency to overeat in response to stimuli, such as stress or when being faced with hyperpalatable foods, okay? So this is things that would lead you to break the diet or mess up on the diet. And it got worse in the continuous dieting group and actually got better in the diet break group, which is really interesting. So now we have 2 independent labs looking at similar, populations. So POs and colleagues used both men and women. It was, I think, 61 resistance-trained athletes, 32 of them are women, so roughly 50% split. And Seidler and colleagues was 38 resistance-trained women for 2 different dieting periods. We had 12 weeks of total dieting versus 6 weeks of total dieting. Similar findings. The diet breaks seem to make dieting feel easier. They enhance the ability to stick to the diet. They manage appetite, satiety, perhaps both through physiological and psychological mechanisms, as PYY was enhanced in POs and colleagues. They didn't, measure PYY in Seidler, but nonetheless, it seems like the psychological and satiety-based benefits are the primary benefits from diet breaks, not necessarily what Byrne and colleagues observed of enhancing fat loss or enhancing metabolic rate. And now we have to look at, okay, well, what happened in Byrne? Why did they find these physiological benefits? And perhaps it was the differences in the populations. We were looking at resistance-trained athletes, resistance-trained women, and just having spoken to the folks involved with both of these last 2 studies and been involved with the first one, they felt like they had pretty good compliance from these participants. Athletes tend to be kind of like, hey, I know how to follow orders. I'll do what the coach says. I'm going to follow it. This is, of course, not a knock for the participants at Byrne and colleagues. I think it probably gives us a better idea of what's going to happen in the more general population. But probably what happened is the group doing the diet breaks that Byrne and colleagues observed had better satiety, had better appetite control, had less disinhibition, and were able to stick to the diet and lost more fat mass. And that's probably what drove the body composition-derived changes in REE as well as fat loss. And that was probably displayed in the fact that they were able to retain that fat loss better than the continuous group long-term. So now when you paint it from that perspective, all 3 studies seem to suggest that diet breaks make dieting easier. Now, there are 2 more things I want to bring up because I think the first thing to go is, I'm big on terms of quantitative physiological differences. I like that kind of science. This is disappointing because it sounds like diet breaks are not doing anything for my metabolic rate or my body composition. And I would say that we can't quite close that door yet. And that's because, sure, metabolic adaptations were not suppressed by diet breaks. They weren't, we didn't see less metabolic adaptation in diet break groups in these last couple studies by both, POs and Seidler. However, we have to actually observe metabolic adaptations to be able to test whether or not it works. And there's actually a great quote by Seidler and colleagues. I'm just going to read. Okay, here it is. If the energy deficit, duration of the diet, and reductions in protein intake are not severe enough to induce metabolic adaptations and a loss of fat-free mass, a diet break or any other strategy employed will have limited to no utility for improving metabolic adaptations or adverse physiologic outcomes that the prescribed diet failed to induce. And that makes sense, right? Like, if a diet did not induce metabolic adaptations, no matter how you structure it, we can't see those metabolic adaptations get reversed or suppressed. So I think the final frontier for really answering the question about energy expenditure for diet breaks is doing this in people where we would expect to see metabolic adaptation. And you may recall it wasn't too long ago where I did a little update on some research that I collaborated on out of Finland. Isola and colleagues looked at a large-scale sample of female and male physique athletes in 2023. It just published back in earlier last month, about a month ago. Weight loss induces changes in adaptive thermogenesis in female and male physique athletes. That is a population. That study found that on average, there were metabolic adaptations in physique athletes going through contest prep. That's a normal part. That's expected to occur in physique athletes who are getting really, really lean and dieting for 6 months to do so. So I think if we were to try to do a little more data collection in this area, we should think about how can we observe whether or not physique athletes getting really lean and dieting for longer periods than have been observed thus far, are they somehow mitigating some of the metabolic adaptations once they're starting to actually observe them, which is the normal experience when they're really deep into contest prep. I would say I'm not hopeful that that is the case, but I think it's impossible to answer the question of do diet breaks, reverse metabolic adaptation or slow the pace of metabolic adaptation if we're not actually observing metabolic adaptation in our studies. So like I said, I'm not holding out hope. My main perspective is that these are probably beneficial from an appetite regulation and just making a diet easy to adhere. And the second point I want to make, and we're going to close out with this one, is that may be even more important. I can tell you from coaching physique athletes for, it's been too long now, 14 years of coaching physique athletes. And since competing since 2007, I'm now actually in my 5th competition season in 2023, that the difference many times in whether a competitor gets absolutely peeled or shredded or leaner than last time and reaches new heights of performance in physique sport is based upon whether they can grit out the process even longer. So in 2007, personal story, I planned to compete in July as well as May. I only made it to May. I called uncle. I just couldn't keep going. It was my first season. I got reasonably lean. And then I just, binged myself back up to 40 pounds over stage weight within a few months. And that's not an isolated experience by any means. 2009, I now had the experience and I took a slightly better approach. I was on the more cutting edge evidence-based side of things. But again, this is 14 years ago. And I didn't do everything that well. And I was still just a second time, seasoned competitor. I got a lot leaner. I actually got quote unquote legally shredded, if you will, but it took a ton of time and it really took a lot out of me. And the difference between 2009, 2007, and even 2011 and 2019, where I got the leanest I've ever been, and it felt the easiest, was that I had the experience and I had the tools to make the process feel easier so I could push myself further. And the way this pans out as a coach, extending beyond my own personal anecdotal experience, is that some athletes, they simply call uncle like I did in 07. They go, you know what, I can't keep going. I'm going to call this diet at 20 weeks because I just really can't keep going. This is affecting me too much. And they don't get quite as lean as they want to. Other athletes, sometimes they start slipping up on the diet more and more and more. So they have binge eating episodes and they're unable to sustain the deficit to get as lean as they need to. And those are typically the two things that happen. People either call uncle or they just can't adhere. So anything we can do as coaches to make a diet easier is going to allow the athlete to push further because we've lowered one of the main barriers to high-level conditioning in those individual athletes, the difficulty, the qualitative, subjective experience of difficulty of contest prep. If you can lower that, you're going to see athletes get leaner. And I know that goes against our kind of quantitative physiological bias that, look, if we're not actually able to enhance fat loss mechanistically, then how is this going to help me in contest prep? Well, I can tell you from having worked with hundreds of athletes that even the hardest-nosed, analytical, engineer-minded bodybuilder who's OCD and dots every T, crosses every I know you do the opposite, I'm just saying silly things, who really believes that, I could drink blood and I will do whatever is necessary. Yeah, until you get punched in the face. And I have been there. I've thought I was the same. Everyone has their limits. And when you can extend those limits and when you find out that you're actually stronger than you thought possible, that's one way to get better. But another way is just to make it less hard so you can push further and get leaner and compete. So anyway, I think we really should not dismiss diet breaks' utility in certain contexts, and that probably explains just the psychological and satiety-related aspects of diet breaks, the experiences of success we've had with our clients at 3DMJ. But I'll leave it there. I think it'd be really exciting to see more research specifically in physique athletes for this, and I actually think in more general population people as well, based upon Burns' findings at the 6-month follow-up. Because it may be that if you can make the diet itself easier, that weight regain becomes less likely. So once again, I want to just say my apologies on behalf of Iron Culture that it is only me, and hopefully you've made it this long and you haven't thought, wow, what a dry, banterless, monotone, science-heavy piece of crap podcast that was. Where is my Omar? If that was the case, my apologies. He will be back next week. But I hope you enjoyed this to the degree you could with only half of the 2 cult leaders atop the pyramid. And we will be back every single insert date here. Make sure you leave a rating, review. Most people leave a 5-star rating. You can leave whatever you want, but I would highly encourage you to make what you want, what I want you to want, which is 5 stars. And we'll see you next time on Iron Culture.